So it is indeed a pleasure to welcome you all here to our session. And I have a couple of just housekeeping notes, et cetera. So I'll plan to bring this up, but I'll start by introducing myself. I am Tangela Purnell. I'm an associate professor at Johns Hopkins University, and I'm also a member of this year's Spring Clinical Meeting Planning Committee. And so it is indeed my pleasure to chair today's session. We are very excited, and we will be showcasing innovative studies and advancements in kidney care, and we have a really exciting slate of speakers and presenters. So we'll start with our first speaker, Dr. Gabriel, who will be presenting on the impact of heat exposure on kidney transplant outcomes. And he is currently a postdoctoral research fellow at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. And you can look on the app to see the full bios of our amazing speakers. And the format for today will be approximately 12 minutes for the presentation and about 2 to 3 minutes Q&A. And so I'll be here monitoring the app. We invite you all to also use the app to submit questions in real time. If not, immediately following, you are welcome to use the mic to come up and ask your questions. So please join me in welcoming our very first speaker for today.
Thank you for the introduction. So let's begin. No disclosures. So our study's objectives were first to evaluate the association between heat exposure and post-transplant kidney function decline in US kidney transplant recipients. Two, to determine the impact of heat exposure and major adverse kidney events in US kidney transplant recipients. And three, finally, to elaborate on existing mechanistic insights by examining the effects of heat exposure on kidney function and transplant outcomes. So, does ambient heat exposure cause kidney disease? There is no conclusive answer to this question. However, heat stress has been associated with detrimental kidney health and is a potential aggravating factor for some kidney diseases. Individuals continuously subjected to heat stress, namely agricultural workers in tropical and subtropical regions, are disproportionately affected by chronic kidney disease. And while the exact mechanisms of this association remain unknown, rising global temperatures pose significant threats to kidney health. In addition to being a potential CKD aggravating factor, ambient heat exposure has also been shown to impact kidney function in individuals with underlying kidney disease. In this plot, we see the main results from a sub-analysis of the DAPA-CKD clinical trial evaluating the association between ambient heat exposure and eGFR slope. The y-axis represents the percent change from baseline eGFR for each 30 days of exposure to a pre-specified threshold shown in the x-axis. The authors show that individuals with CKD exposed to a higher proportion of days with a high heat index had a steeper eGFR slope than those exposed to lower heat indices. However, whether the exposure to heat affects kidney transplant recipients remains to be determined. Conceptually, the impact of heat exposure on kidney function depends on the magnitude of the exposure, which may be modified by several factors, including work, occupational stress, clothing, acclimatization, etc., and the unique milieu of kidney transplant recipients, including medications, the complex immune system interactions, and underlying kidney disease risk factors, which may ultimately lead to CKD progression, kidney function decline, and eventual graft failure. So we asked ourselves, does ambient heat exposure impact kidney transplant outcomes? To answer this question, we conducted a retrospective cohort study using the UNOS dataset of United States kidney transplant recipients. We included individuals from 2010 with follow-up until 2024. We included 63,351 first-time kidney-only transplant recipients from the US. Inclusion criteria were at least 18 years of age, having follow-up for at least 12 months post-transplant to ensure a steady state, and to have 2 or more creatinine measurements throughout follow-up to ensure consistent follow-up in the dataset, as is UNOS protocol. We excluded individuals who experienced death, graft loss, or acute rejection within the 12 first months after transplant, individuals with multi-organ transplant or retransplants. The median follow-up in our study was 4.8 years. Our primary exposure was the heat index. The heat index is a calculated measure of perceived heat that includes relative humidity and ambient dry bulb temperature. We obtained the time-updated proportion of days with a heat index above a pre-specified threshold, the primary being 30 degrees Celsius or 86 Fahrenheit. We obtained this information from the ERA 5 reanalysis dataset to determine the unique heat exposure for each participant using center-level data. The primary endpoint of our study was the eGFR slope, defined as the percent eGFR change from baseline. We utilized two methods for this analysis. A case time series, which aimed to control for time constant within subject differences, and B, a multi-level mixed effects model for observations nested within individuals, nested within centers. Our secondary outcome was major adverse kidney events, or MAKE, which was a composite of death from any cause, graft failure, or doubling of serum creatinine. For these analyses, we modeled a complementary log-log discrete time survival analysis for observations nested within individuals, nested within centers. It is worth noting that the models were adjusted for seasonal variations and clinically relevant transplant, donor, and recipient covariates. In this slide, we see a map of the US showing the proportion of days with a heat index above 30 degrees Celsius in the US during the study period from 2010 to 2024. On average, the median heat exposure was 1.3% per centers. That means that centers on average experience about 1% of the days throughout these follow-up periods with an average daily heat index over 30 degrees Celsius. However, the hottest centers experience a median proportion of days with a heat index above the threshold of 20%, and the coldest centers experience a median of 0 days over 30%. Overall, baseline cohort characteristics are representative of the US transplant population and did not differ significantly between groups based on time accumulated heat exposure, meaning the total proportion of days with a heat index over 30. 39% of the cohort was female, mean age was 53 years, and almost half were white, non-Hispanic. Individuals in the highest quartiles were less likely to be white. Most patients were on tacrolimus regardless of quartile. Individuals more exposed to heat were less likely to receive a living donor kidney transplant, had a higher CPRA, and were less likely to work for income at listing. In our primary analyses, we observed that increased heat exposure was associated with a progressive and faster eGFR decline. The plot shows the results of the primary mixed effects models and case time series models. On the y-axis, we see the percent eGFR change from baseline per each additional year exposed to a heat index above the threshold, which is shown in the x-axis. The results can be interpreted as follows. In the case time series, each additional year with an average heat index over 30 degrees Celsius was associated with a yearly eGFR decline of 1.4% from baseline. To put these results into perspective, in a hypothetical kidney transplant recipient with a baseline GFR equal to our cohort's mean of 60 and exposed to the maximum observed annual individual level proportion of days with a heat index over 30, which was 38%, a year's exposure based on the case time series would be equivalent, all other things being equal, to a decline of 0.3 per year faster GFR compared to a KTR located in the coldest centers with 0 days with a heat index above 30. We observed no differences in subgroup analyses based on donor type, the use of tacrolimus at discharge. However, notably, individuals with lower baseline eGFRs had a faster eGFR decline associated with heat exposure. Finally, there were no differences in individuals according to county-level annual household incomes. In our secondary analyses, we observed that the increased heat exposure was associated with a higher major adverse kidney events risk. The Kaplan-Meier plot on the slide displays the association between time-accumulated heat exposure quartiles and MAKE over time. The y-axis shows the survival probability, and the x-axis the time from transplantation. Individuals in the highest heat exposure quartiles had a higher major adverse kidney events risk compared to the lowest quartiles. Overall, we found that individuals exposed to heat exposure in each additional year with a heat index above 30 was associated with a 30% higher risk of major adverse kidney events defined as death, graft failure, or doubling of serum creatinine. So in conclusion, in the United States, kidney transplant recipients' higher heat exposure was independently associated with a modest progressive kidney transplant function decline and increased major adverse kidney events risk compared to lower heat exposure. Therefore, preventing heat exposure in kidney transplant recipients should receive higher priority in research, public health efforts, and clinical practice to prevent adverse kidney transplant outcomes. Finally, I'd like to take a moment to thank everyone who has supported this research and has mentored me throughout the process, and please feel free to contact me with any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Do we have any questions from the audience? I was looking on the app and I do not yet see any. And I'm happy to start I'm happy to start with an initial question. So when we think about recent summers and winters, right, it is getting increasingly warmer, in particular in places that were already, pretty high heat exposure. So do you have any, recommendations for people who may be working in places that are under-resourced or may have infrastructure issues? I noticed Mississippi, for example, as one of the states highlighted, and I'm, reminded of the water crisis, et cetera, and having to practice clinical care in tents outside. So are there any recommendations moving forward for emergency preparedness in light of your study findings?
So I guess there is no actual recommendation, no consensus, and there is still debate on whether heat exposure causes kidney disease. However, what we know is that it can aggravate it and that it can cause both AKI and kidney stone episodes. So there was a recent study looking at occupational work exposure and identified that being exposed for a prolonged time to more than 24 degrees Celsius was associated with a higher heat-related injury, so probably trying to prevent that, trying to prevent as well prolonged periods without adequate water intake or excess water intake as well. And we know that in general, more and more recently we're seeing these studies looking at agricultural workers who are exposed to prolonged periods of heat and have these events. So water intake in transplant specifically, probably that combined with medications and other behavioral exposures would be reasonable.
Thank you.
That was an awesome talk. My question is about whether you have any data on patients who started in a high heat stress situation and then moved to perhaps a low stress situation, whether the GFR kind of levels would be expected to level off or whether they might recover.
So that's a great question, and unfortunately we do not. We are using here center level data, which is a proxy for individual level data. We know that at least half of transplant patients live within 23 miles of their transplant center, so pretty close. However, we did not account for migration or indoor exposure versus outdoor exposure, so we don't know, and it's an area for future research for sure.
And we have one final question that was submitted through the app. Do you support conducting the pilot study proposed by the modified NOTA, the End Kidney Death Act, should NKF survey its members? I think that's for you.
Could you repeat the question, please?
Did someone in the room actually submit that question via the app? Maybe someone may have accidentally put it into our session. I didn't quite follow how it followed your talk either, but just that I would say it out loud just in case I was missing it. But any final recommendations for NKF members and how we can support more research in this area?
So I guess it's just awareness, the sense that climate change is worrying for kidney health and health in general, and that we should all be aware of that and try to make efforts to mitigate the global changes. And that's it. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks. Thank you so much. So our next presenter is Dr. Otunla, who will be presenting on the impact of donation after circulatory death on kidney allograft survival is influenced by donor race, a UNOS registry analysis. And Dr. Otunla is a PhD student who is investigating the role of immunometabolism in acute kidney injury at the University College in London, and he graduated from the University of Oxford Medical School. And so we are excited to learn more about your findings. So welcome.
Perfect. Thanks very much for the introduction. It's lovely to be in the United States of America. So start us off with no conflicts of interest to declare. And first of all, a little bit of background. So kidney transplantation, as you all know, represents the gold standard treatment for end-stage renal disease. So over 20,000 a year performed in the United States, and it increases both the length and the quality of life of patients with end-stage renal disease when compared to dialysis. So as many of you will know, there are two types of kidney transplantation. There's living donation and deceased donation. Deceased donation makes up the vast majority, both in the United Kingdom and the United States, of kidney transplants at about 70 to 80%. And then this is then split up into two types based on how the organ is actually procured. So these are donation after circulatory death, which I'll be referring to as DCD for the rest of this talk, and donation after brain death, which is DBD. So as a short overview, in both donor types, what happens is the donor is typically in an intensive care unit, requiring a degree of cardiorespiratory support to kind of perfuse their organs and also to keep them ventilated. So in DBD donors, the person is declared brain dead, and therefore the organs can essentially be procured and the person is taken to theatre, and then procurement kind of begins. However, in DCD donation, because there is some residual brain function, you obviously can't go on procurement until the person has been declared dead. In order for that to happen, you need to withdraw the cardiorespiratory support, and then you need to wait until the heart stops or mechanical asystole. Then you've got a little bit of time to ensure that kind of asystole has occurred, which varies from country to country, and it's only then when you can begin organ procurement. So donation after circulatory death has traditionally been associated with worse medium to long-term graft survival and general long-term outcomes compared to their donation after brain dead counterparts. This has been attributed to the kind of variable period of warm ischemia from, as I've just described, this period where you withdraw the cardiorespiratory support until you've got mechanical asystole, which is obviously unique to DCD donation. However, recent large-scale registry analyses, initially coming from the United Kingdom, but have since kind of been replicated in the United States, have demonstrated equivocal, if not comparable, medium to long-term graft survival between the two cohorts. And as a result, in both countries, DCD donation has kind of rapidly expanded, increasing yearly across the last decade. So, however, these large-scale registry analyses have not typically looked at whether donor race impacts the relationship between DCD donation and graft survival. That is to say, whether the impact of DCD donation on graft survival is the same across different donor ethnicities. So the only study that has actually investigated this was a cohort study by Locke in 2008. And what they did was they explored the role of donor race on graft survival in black donor recipients. So they found that in black donor recipients, black donor DCD kidneys, which is represented by the fully shaded red line at the very top of the Kaplan-Meier curve on the screen now, did significantly better than their DBD counterparts, which is the dashed red line, which went completely against thinking at the time, which was that the opposite should have been the case. And this is actually what we're seeing in the white cohort here, in the white donor cohort, where the white DBD donors did better than the DCD donors. However, the study was quite heavily criticized at the time because it's quite a small sample size, only had about 142 black donors in this cohort, and the fact that they didn't actually control for any socioeconomic factors in their multivariate modeling, which, as you can assume when a study that looks at racial disparities, was quite a significant drawback. Also, this study is now around 15 years old, so the more contemporary criticism has been, DCD allocation has evolved significantly over the last decade or so. So are these findings, even if they were legitimate, are they still relevant? So this is what we sought to address with our study. We sought to kind of plug this knowledge gap in a larger study. We hypothesized that DCD donation does actually impact graft survival in a donor race-specific fashion. And our aim in this study was to investigate this using a larger registry analysis, an up-to-date registry analysis, and using a more robust statistical methodology, and crucially including socioeconomic factors in our multivariate modeling. So to do this, we performed a large-scale retrospective observational analysis of the UNOS database, which, as you've kind of just heard, is a large database containing donor and recipient information, as well as transplant outcomes from almost all solid organ transplants in the United States. So we used data from August 1987 to May 2020, and inclusion criteria were adult single-organ kidney transplant recipients, meaning we excluded retransplants, we excluded multi-organ transplants, and we also excluded all pediatric transplants as well. So we use multiple imputation to handle missing data, ensuring high fidelity imputation using convergence curves, and also by completing a complete case sensitivity analysis. We then averaged our results over about 50 different imputed data sets. So this left us a cohort of about 200,000 patients from whom we extracted a range of relevant baseline characteristics. Patients were then kind of subcategorized by donor race. The primary outcome was graft survival at 10 years, although we also did look at graft survival at 1 year, 3 year, and 5 years. We performed risk-adjusted outcomes assessed by multivariate Cox proportional hazard modeling, controlling for factors which are on the next slide, and we visualized our univariate findings using a Kaplan-Meier survival curves. So in terms of our results in our cohort upon our initial univariate analysis, DCD donation was clearly associated with worse graft survival than their DBD counterparts, as illustrated by the pictured Kaplan-Meier survival curve, where the DCD cohort is in blue and the DBD cohort is in red. However, when we then performed a multivariate analysis adjusting for the features on the top left of your screen, this difference in DCD and DBD donation reduced to almost essentially equivocal outcomes between the two across all of our time points, which is very much in keeping with the large registry analyses that have already been published demonstrated, which is quite reassuring. However, what was interesting is that when we then stratified our findings by race, a clear pattern emerged. So in white, other, and Asian donors, there was no statistically significant difference in graft survival between DBD and DCD cohorts across any of the time points, as we kind of had expected based on our previous multivariate model where we didn't stratify by race. However, once you look at the results in black donors, DCD donation was associated with actually improved graft survival compared to their DBD counterparts at all 4 time points. So in order to kind of explore this further, what we decided to do was look at the impact of individual donor-recipient race pairings on this observed effect of potentially donor race modification and the impact of DCD donation on graft survival. So on the kind of Kaplan-Meier survival curves on the top left and the top right, these represent the effects of the difference in DCD and DBD donation in white donors, in black recipient groups and in white recipient groups. And in the 2 Kaplan-Meier curves below that is what happens when you switch these white donors for black donors. And as you can kind of see, you get this convergence in these 2 lines, which is quite suggestive of some kind of donor race modification. So then that was the univariate analysis. Then when we looked at it in the multivariate analysis, this kind of donor race modification persisted, with black donor DCD organs doing better than their DBD counterpoints in both black and white recipients across all time points. This was a contrast to their white donor counterparts, where there was no statistically significant difference between DCD and DBD donors. So what do these findings suggest? So these findings suggest that donor race modifies the relationship between DCD donation and graft survival. This demonstrates that the relationship between DCD donation and graft survival might be a little bit more nuanced than we originally had thought, and also could point at differences in kind of physiological handling of ischemia reperfusion injury across different ethnicities. As it appears from our results anyway, the black donors seem to do a little bit better, or black donor kidney seems to do a little bit better in response to this warm ischemic hit that they're seeing in DCD donation, which you obviously don't see as much in DBD donation. So in terms of some kind of like biological mechanism, I think what's important here is we look at the pathophysiology of ischemic reperfusion injury. So I'll just take you through that quickly. So it's 2-pronged. So there's an oxidative stress component and there's an inflammatory component. So what happens is hypoxia leads to mitochondrial dysfunction, cell de-energization, free radical production, and then reoxide-oxide species generation. This then leads to a pro-inflammatory state with proximal tubular epithelial cells releasing their pro-inflammatory cytokines, so your interleukins, your TNF-alphas, which then leads to the recruitment of the cells of the innate immune system to the area, so your neutrophils and your macrophages. So then reperfusion then obviously brings more of these kind of circulating cells of the innate immune system to the site of injury, compounding the injury. But what it also does is it also kind of restarts oxidative phosphorylation, generating an oxide species burst, which then also compounds this oxidative stress. So there's actually quite good evidence in the literature to demonstrate clear racial differences in both arms of this response. So we'll start off with the oxidative stress, which is the paper on the bottom right of your screen from 2011, which essentially looked at the expression of antioxidant enzymes in the plasma and also in the endothelial cells from African-American cohorts versus Caucasian cohorts. And interestingly, what was found was that African-American cohorts had a bit higher, had statistically significantly higher levels of superoxide dismutase and also of endothelial nitric oxide synthase, both of which serve kind of protective and free radical scavenging. So there's also some evidence for racial disparities in the immune response to ischemia reperfusion injury, which you can kind of extrapolate from the work in the lupus literature, which essentially show that there's some racial differences in toll-like receptor expression, not only in their expression, but also in the downstream cytokine pathways which they activate. But this is being particularly relevant in ischemia reperfusion injury because there's pretty good animal model evidence to suggest that toll-like receptors, specifically TLR2, 3, and 4, actually do mediate this response with knockout mice actually doing better when you knock out toll-like receptor 2 to 4 in response to renal ischemia reperfusion injury. So what's the conclusion here? So whilst this is an interesting finding, of course, it's important to note that this study is subject to the inherent limitation of any large database study. So we could only encode for the studies that with the variables that are encoded within the database. And whilst we did handle missing data in what we thought was quite a robust mechanism, obviously it's not as good as a complete case analysis. So in terms of the impact of this study, we kind of hope that this work stimulates smaller cohort studies with a bit more of a fine regulation of the variables that go into them, and to demonstrate whether, is this just a statistical anomaly or is there a biological process going on here that needs to be investigated. So to round up, in terms of the next steps for us, we've recently applied for an extension of the UNOS database, looking for a bit more geographically tagged data to try and do a hierarchical clustered analysis to demonstrate, is this kind of a racial thing or is this just a socioeconomic thing tied to the location of the center? We've also recently had a data request from the NHS equivalent of UNOS to run the same kind of experiment in the UK to see if it is just kind of an American thing or if something similar is going on in Britain. To finish, I'd like to thank the MDR CoLab for supporting me in this research project, but specifically Joe, Kuman, Reza, and also Justin, without whom this project would not have been possible. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you so much. We are now open for questions. Y'all got me scared to look back at this Slido app because who knows what I might be asking, if it's relevant or not. But do you have a question? Sure.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I have two questions, actually. One is, do you have any data on the use of machine perfusion techniques for these kidneys and if this may change the outcomes?
It's a very good point. So we did include machine-perfused kidneys because it is one of the variables at UNOS in our multivariate analysis, and it did show a statistically significant association, and we controlled for it as best as we could. But to answer your question, we could probably have done a sub-analysis looking just at machine-perfused kidneys and seeing if the effect was propagated, but I don't think we would have had the statistical significance.
Great. And the second one is, so as you may know, there are efforts in eliminating race and Hep C virus from the KDPI calculations, which drives kind of organ allocation. How do you think these findings may change those initiatives?
I think it's an important question. I think the problem with kind of taking donor race or recipient races as a whole without looking into the nuance that you can kind of miss effects like this. Because I mean, if it may not be as relevant, for example, if you're not looking at DCD versus DBD cohorts, but we've kind of clearly shown that in this case, it might be something that should be kept within the scoring systems.
I have a question regarding your findings about inflammation and its potential role in this. And so I'm curious to know if, even if it's beyond the scope of this project, but within any of your work, have you explored any potential solutions to what we can, perhaps do? So, for example, there may be some associations that we're seeing between inflammation and inflammatory markers and race, et cetera. Are there any lessons that could be learned in terms of our processes and, how we keep our kidneys going, et cetera? Are there things that we can do differently from a process mechanism that may help us to mitigate some of these differences?
I think it needs to kind of start from the ground up. So it needs to start from the research. I think a lot of research kind of homogenizes their cohorts in terms of, especially with race. And what we're trying to do, especially with our study looking at immunometabolism, is we're looking at kind of like black cohorts versus white cohorts versus kind of other, to see if there are any differences there. Because if you don't take that into consideration, what you have is studies like this where essentially we can't really tease out any biological differences.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
All right, thank you. All right, so I'm happy to welcome our third speaker, Dr. Stephanie, who will be presenting on comparing barriers and promoters to pediatric living donor kidney transplantation by language preference, a mixed method study. And she is a third-year pediatric nephrology fellow at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and is very passionate about understanding and addressing inequities in healthcare, particularly for children with kidney disease. So welcome.
Thank you for the invitation to share my research, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. I have no disclosures to share. During this time, I'm going to compare some of the barriers and facilitators to living donor kidney transplantation in children, particularly between those who come from families who prefer to speak English and those who come from families who prefer languages other than English. I'll also explore some of these facilitators and barriers for all patients at different levels of the social ecological model of health. And I hope to end with telling you more about future targeted interventions that I believe can increase equitable access to living donor kidney transplantation in children. As I think everyone in this room knows, is that there's a huge need for kidney donors with about 90,000 patients on the kidney waiting list as candidates in the United States. Just last year, just under 28,000 kidney transplants were performed, with the vast majority of them being kidneys from deceased donors and only about 23% from living donors. As most in the room know, we really do prefer living kidney donation for many reasons. It facilitates preemptive transplant, which saves our patients from some of the physical and emotional challenges of being on chronic dialysis. We know that grafts that come from living donors have better long-term survival. And ultimately, if we can increase the number of living kidney donations, we expand the pool of available organs for everyone, adults, children, those who receive kidneys from deceased and living donors. This was some work that I had done prior to my fellowship, trying to understand outcomes in pediatric kidney transplantation. And one finding that really struck me was just the difference between access, or the receipt of living kidney donors, between those from families who prefer English and those who prefer other languages other than English. At this single center, only about 22% of patients who preferred languages other than English received a kidney from a living donor, versus about 70% in that same cohort who came from families who did speak English. And my question really is why? And so I found that the social ecological model of health has lent itself really well to trying to understand the different possible factors that could be contributing. In this model, it holds that there are multiple levels that affect a patient's health and health outcomes, including intrapersonal, interpersonal, community, organization, and policies and environment. And that these levels, while distinct, also interact with one another. So for this mixed method study, in the quantitative side, I did a chart review retrospectively of patients transplanted at my center over the last 5 years. It included about 93 patients. And for the qualitative arm, I did semi-structured interviews, both in caregivers who prefer to speak English and languages other than English, as well as key informants such as physicians, social workers, real experts in the field who have a different level, a different perspective on where these barriers and promoters might be. And through the mixed method, I used a convergent design so that these quantitative results are explained from the qualitative themes. So just very briefly, I'll get into this more in subsequent slides, but in doing the retrospective chart review, I was looking at demographic, medical, and social factors, many of which come from our social workers' initial evaluation for transplant candidates. And for the qualitative side, I developed two interview guides, one for the caregivers and one for the key informants, that had questions really at all levels of this social ecological model. So just highlighting one example, in the caregiver interview guide, I would ask questions to target some of the community level by asking, how do community organizations like community centers, schools, churches support your family during the transplant journey? So getting into the results, starting with the quantitative results, just who were our patients? In general, most of the patients at the time of evaluation were around 10 years of age. The majority were non-Hispanic, about 50% were white, 30% were Black, and the remainder were made of Asian, multiracial, or unspecified. There were many social factors that I could get into. I'm just going to highlight a couple. One being the number of patients who worked with interpreters at their medical appointments was about 18%, which correlates with US Census data, which estimates that about 1 in 5 children live in families that speak languages other than English. Another few points is that in terms of transportation, about 80% of our families relied solely on a personal or family car. In terms of income source, about 65% exclusively experienced income from their wages and salaries, with others who also had supplemental income coming from things like child support, SNAP for food assistance, or Social Security. And then about half of our patients received private insurance, with 43%, another large percentage, receiving Medicaid as their primary insurance. And about 65% of our patients did not have any secondary insurance. So then getting into how did these different factors affect if a child received a kidney from a living or deceased donor, Similar to some of the disparities that have already been discussed today, Black patients were significantly less likely to receive a kidney from a living donor compared to white patients. Looking at some of the social factors, there was not a statistically significant difference in our population between those who preferred English and those who preferred other languages, but I will highlight that the sample size was quite small, only 17 patients who worked with interpreters at our center over the last 5 years, and that about 70% of them received a kidney from a deceased donor versus only about 55% of our general population. Some other social factors that affected the receipt of a living versus deceased donor include transportation, with those who required medical assistance transportation less likely to receive a living donor transplantation, and similarly, those who received income from SNAP or Social Security, had Medicaid as a primary health insurance, and did not have secondary medical insurance, all were less likely to receive kidney from a living donor. So getting into the qualitative analyses, I've completed to date about 38 interviews, 21 of those in caregivers, and about 24% of those interviews have been done with patients who prefer languages, or with caregivers who prefer languages other than English. And then I've done 17 interviews with key informants, both in our partner adult center, who does our living donor evaluations, as well as at our pediatric center. I want to just highlight some of the experiences from the caregivers who prefer languages other than English about facilitators and barriers that they note. In terms of facilitators, a lot really highlight the value of having good and reliable interpreter and translation services, particularly in-person interpreters. They highlight how many of our social workers' support go above and beyond in helping them arrange transportation rides, helping them secure reliable housing, and complete some documents that they may struggle to complete due to language barrier, and just how incredibly savvy many of our patient caregivers are in using some of the new technology and translation services to overcome obstacles. Some barriers include scheduling appointments. We ask our donor candidates to complete a lot of appointments, and not only within nephrology, but also urology and several other subspecialties, and sometimes scheduling appointments in all these different places may not be equally accommodating to patients who speak other languages. The other thing is length of interpreted appointments. Both caregivers who spoke English and other languages highlight how long some of these evaluation appointments are, and if everything is being interpreted, that can take twice as long and serve as a real challenge for some of our families who have other obligations with their time. And finally, access to health insurance and financial resources, such as living donor wage reimbursements, may not be present for all of these families, particularly depending on where they're at in their path to citizenship. So now just covering from all of the interviews that were completed, from those who spoke English and languages other than English, as well as key informants. At different levels of the social ecological model of health, many facilitators and barriers were highlighted. I'll just name a few. So in terms of personal and family beliefs coming into play, one parent explained that they didn't look for other living donors because they didn't want people to see their child differently. Time came into play for some as actually a facilitator for living donation because they didn't want to have to wait. Emotions like fear and having positive attitudes were contributory, as well as fear of feeling stupid in front of the medical team. In terms of interpersonal, just the immense role that having supportive friends and family come into play, particularly for families who have other children, and the role of needing to find other care providers for their children if they do serve as living donors. And I'm just going to highlight this quote at the bottom here about communities from one of our key informants, that a lot of families have some community supports. They're their transportation company, they can be their fundraiser or do meals, but on the flip side, they can sometimes actually serve to impede the process by being anti-vaccine or having different medical beliefs. There's, just to be very brief, some other organizational facilitators, like working with the National Kidney Registry for indirect donation, and the way that other things such as citizenship and employers' policies towards FMLA can all come into play. So in conclusion, there's more need that I am working to collect to get more information from caregivers who prefer languages other than English. There are a lot of facilitators and barriers at all levels of the social ecological model, and I don't think that there's a unique one-size-fits-all solution for increasing living donation. I think that future interventions are going to need to account for our families who have different individual circumstances and target all levels of the social ecological model. At the end of my interviews, I always ask families, what can we do to improve? Our key informants, where can we improve? And they have some really great examples or suggestions ranging from the intrapersonal level about increasing non-parent donors and making sure educational materials are accessible in all languages, all the way down to policies and how we think about financial resources, including Medicaid availability for our families. I'd like to acknowledge the support that I've received and the funding. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them now. I'm also will be at poster G570, so please come and find me. I'd love to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have about 2 minutes for questions, so we welcome questions from the audience. If not, I will start by, really posing the unique scenario for pediatric patients in particular, right? So as someone who was encouraged to mimic going through the living donor evaluation process just to see how complicated it is, it's very complex, right? And now when you think about the dynamic of a person who might either be the primary caretaker for this already sick child or the primary earner within the family whose insurance, et cetera, or both. I wonder if there are recommendations from what you've heard so far about what we could be doing from the transplant center perspective to make things easier. So, for example, we've heard of some evaluation processes that have been fast-tracked, a day or two, get it all in, but often those target the easiest, donors. What can we learn from some of the barriers and facilitators that have been recommended by those in your study about things we could do to help with this?
Thank you so much for your question. I think one thing is you're exactly right. Like, our families are superheroes taking care of children with chronic kidney disease, and many of them are on dialysis, especially the little ones, because they have to grow before they're eligible for a kidney. And one thing, at our center, we have distinct adult and pediatric centers, and they're just across the street from each other. And understandably, those evaluations need to be separated. But our families are in our dialysis centers 3, 4, sometimes 5 days a week for their little tiny ones. Or they're in our peritoneal dialysis clinic at least monthly. And so something that has come up is, can you meet us where we are? Like, can we coordinate scheduling of some of these appointments so that we're not here, more than we already are, because we're already here a lot and have such limited time. One other thing that some of the adult donor evaluators pointed out to me is they said, stop sending the moms here to be potential donors. And for us, it's so easy. Like, we see the parents right there. It makes so much sense. They're like, stop sending the moms. They have so much on their plate already. And they really shared some things that many adult providers do in terms of finding a family advocate who can help do some of the search for donors for them. And in the age of indirect exchange and being partnered with National Kidney Registry, I think that's a really great solution that can help relieve some of the burden to not only be a caregiver of a child with chronic kidney disease, but also being a potential donor as well. It's a lot.
It's a lot. And in particular, as you mentioned, about the mom, then the question becomes, well, who's going to take care of the mom during her recovery process?
Exactly.
If she's taking care of the whole family. So
exactly.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again very much. Is a nephrologist in kidney transplant fellowship training at the Division of Nephrology in Thailand. And we welcome you to round us off. We saved the best for last. So welcome.
Thank you, NKF Organizing Committee, for the opportunity to present our work. And on behalf of our author, I would like to present our work on the topic gender disparity in kidney function among non-hypertensive living kidney donors. I have nothing to disclose, and this is my learning objective. The first is to recognize existing gender disparity in kidney function among living kidney donors, and the second, to determine potential confounding factors such as pre-donation hypertension contributing to risk developing kidney function decline in living kidney donors. And the last one, to evaluate the gender as one of the risks of developing kidney function decline in living kidney donors. As we know that gender disparity in kidney function exists, usually males have a rapid progression of chronic kidney disease compared to female, while the disparity after living kidney donor is still unclear. So this study aims to examine the association between the genders and the risk of worsening kidney function in the living kidney donors. Our method is a retrospective cohort study utilizing the data from OPTN SRTR, included a living kidney donor undergoing donation between 1972 and 2022, and generally had follow-up greater than or equal to 3 visits at 6, 12, 24 months post-donation. The association between gender and the time to event of worsening post-donation kidney function greater than or equal to 35% from the baseline. Pre-donation kidney function, and was examined by multiple proportional hazard regression analysis. Here is the result. Okay, we have 174,000 adult living kidney donors over 50 years. Meanwhile, it was over 50 years and mean it was 41 years old. The majority, up to 60%, were female. Among 110,000 living kidney donors with a known hypertension status, 3,800 or around 3.5% has pre-donation hypertension. You can see from the figure on the right side, there are two stratified groups, no pre-donation hypertension and pre-donation hypertension. While on the right side, pre-donation, non-pre-donation, on the left side, no pre-donation hypertension, the female donate more than male. While on the right side of the group of the pre-donation hypertension, even if the female still donate more than male, surprisingly that the ratio of the male donation was increased. The result, during the median follow-up time for 6.67 months, the incidence rate of worsening post-donation kidney function was 0.08 per month. From the figure, you see the Kaplan-Meier curve demonstrating the cumulative incidence of timing of the event of greater than or equal 35% decline in post-donation eGFR rate. From pre-donation eGFR rate in the figure A in the right side and classified by gender in the right side. Compared to female living kidney donor, male living kidney donor were 14% greater of developing the event. After we try to adjusting for demographic data like age, race, or socioeconomic status, including U.S. citizenship, level of education, and also we including the pre-donation comorbidity like diabetes, hypertension, BMI, and systolic and diastolic blood pressure, eGFR, and proteinuria. Male living kidney donor still remain at a higher risk of the event. Yes. And we also stratify our study population into groups, including those who had no pre-donation hypertension on the right side and pre-donation hypertension on the right side. As for the figure, Kaplan-Meier curve demonstrating cumulative incidence of time to the event greater than or equal to 35% decline in post-donation eGFR rate. From pre-donation eGFR rate among living kidney donor without hypertension by gender on figure A. On the left-hand side, and with a history of pre-donation hypertension is on the right side on the figure B. You will see those with pre-donation hypertension did not have a greater risk, like male women have a greater risk compared to female, while only male living kidney donor without pre-donation hypertension has a higher risk of the event. And let me summarize the main result we got. Male had a higher risk of developing the event, while only male living kidney donor without pre-donation hypertension had a higher risk of the event. And for the male who with pre-donation hypertension, risk is not the different from female. There are many contributing factors that may lead to worsening kidney function. Hypertension after donation can result in hyperfiltration. Also in post-donation obesity or maybe genetic disease that not yet diagnosed, or maybe NSAID used after donation that we don't have the information, and maybe some other cause that we still lack of information about. For the summary of the findings to explain our study result, first question is why male have higher risk? We think it could be from a biological or psychosocial factor. From the biological factor, maybe because from neurohormonal like estrogen potential prevent effects. From psychosocial, from maybe men have unhealthy lifestyle like smoking, poor diet that contribute to kidney progression more than female. Second question, why the risk of both gender is equal in pre-donation hypertension group? We still thought about the psychosocial factor that male with hypertension have a better level of perception of their disease and took care of themselves better than no pre-donation hypertension group. And maybe the donor selection bias from the transplant program that normally want donor who excellent control in hypertension may cause this too. Our clinical implication, we think that this study raised the important question about the gender difference in kidney health, especially in the context of living kidney donation. However, this is not appropriate to exclude the males without hypertension from the potential donor selection. At the same time, it is confirmed that males with pre-donation hypertension can still be eligible to donate a kidney. Since males without pre-donation hypertension still appear to be a higher risk from the study, I think further studies should delve deeper into potential underlying factors such as genetic difference, lifestyle factors, or even variation in kidney anatomy that could contribute to the disparity. And this study underscored the need for closer monitoring for male living kidney donor post-donation, especially those with pre-donation hypertension, to ensure their long-term kidney health is protected. The strength of this study is first we gathering the information from a large database in US with several years data collection. And the second is we try to adjust as much as possible potential confounding factor. However, there are some limitations, like first, from the registered information, we do not have the long-term after 24 months follow-up. And the second, with the 5 decades data collection, we thought that there were non-standard blood pressure measurement technique and the device to diagnose hypertension. And the third, due to the nature of retrospective study, we cannot claim the causality of gender outcome in kidney function. And the last, some other residual confounder that may not include in this study. So the conclusion from this study is male living kidney donor without pre-donation hypertension have a higher risk for worsening post-donation kidney function compared to the female living kidney donor. So the author, we would like to thank to the Organ Procurement and Transplantation Network and the Scientific Registry of the Transplant Recipient for providing the valuable data for this study. Here is the list of the reference, and thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any question if you may have.
The floor is now open for questions. We have a couple of minutes. So I'll start by just asking about the lack of a standard criteria are used across different centers, as well as changing selection criteria over time. So could you comment on things that may be influencing, or do you suspect that it could be influencing your findings in either way? So again, just not using the exact same selection criteria. So some transplant centers, allowing hypertension plus or minus other risk factors, et cetera.
I think from the consensus or the guideline, we still concerned for about hypertension patient for the donate. Like if they have poor control hypertension, I think the doctor, the transplant doctor or the nephrologist should be concerned about that, and they may not be the candidate for the donate. By the way, from this study, I think that the hypertension donor, even if it's a male or female, they can donate because the risk is equal. I think maybe it's increase their potential donor in the future.
Thank you. Do we have any additional questions? All right.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
You.